Good evening, YouTube. John here. We're going to start the day one officially of anatomy of a drag car. And yes, of course, we'll cover drag car carburation today. We'll also touch on some street car things. But in this conversation, we'll try and keep it really limited to carburation specifically, not talk about intakes or any of the other downstream, quite literally, effects of carburation, whether it be a single barrel, snowmobile or snow blower carburetor to an actual full-blown, 1250 plus Holley Dominator. So we'll start with just the various types. Carter AFB, Edelbrock, there's the Holley 4150, the Holley 4500, there's Thermoquad, to quote David Freiberger. There's many types to get your vehicle, and of course Quadrajet, my gosh, there's many types to get your vehicle moving. And the most prevalent ones on the track, the drag strip, are going to be Holley 4150s. But we'll get there in a moment or so. So just on the quick hit list of experiences that I've had with carburetors, in shop class at high school, our shop teacher, Mr. B, brought in a really dirty, junky C20, I believe, from like a neighboring field, quite literally in our town. He took the junky Holley off of it, and no one else was really interested in it. And I offered to give like $25. Like, is that a good? He's like, no, take it. Just get rid of it. Have fun with it. So this carburetor has jets. It has air bleeds. Some of them have adjustable air bleeds. This one certainly did not. This was a 4160 style Holley. It was one with a vacuum secondary pod on the side of it. That is generally better for street cars, but I did cut my teeth learning about that carburetor by taking it apart and trying my damnedest to put it back together. Obviously, I didn't run. I didn't try. I didn't put it on a car. I didn't have a car to put it on, but I took it apart, cleaned it, put it back together with the best I could, and I gave it back to him. And he was like, "Do you want it?" And he's like, "No." I'm like, "All right, well, cool. I learned something." And to his credit, the car ran much better with. I don't remember exactly what he put it on after. He put something on that car after. The truck sounded nasty, rather. That is the Holley story to start, and then I jumped when I bought a first class car. It was a 1976 Corvette, and it had a whopping 180 horsepower. And I mean, that's all they were doing. They were in the middle of the emissions, arguably a gas and oil crisis, and emissions at the same time. So tough spot to be in. And with SAE gross horsepower, which they used to measure, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, everybody, but they used to, and call it pre-1972, they would measure SAE gross horsepower. The temperature of the engine air, the air in the room, was 60 degrees. There were no accessories on the engine. There wasn't an alternator, there wasn't a power steering pump. Wasn't things that you would expect to have on an engine, we'll call it. And then they moved to SAE net in 1972. And ballparking a number, they would cut roughly the power out of the engine by 15 to 20%. And as a result, well, horsepower went down. And then also what actually did hurt horsepower, and therefore the choices for carburation, they stopped putting the Holleys on the highest performance Chevrolets at the time, but they focused more on gas and mileage and efficiency, dropping compression. So another story for another day. But the Quadrajets, by General Motors, produced by Quadrajet themselves, were a staple on many of the Chevy cars. Chevy, Buick, Olds, and Pontiac all had their own model number, and they would use Quadrajets on their cars. So on the Corvette. I had a 76 Corvette, and for some reason, this one didn't have adjustable part throttle, the APT portion of the Quadrajet carburetor. Those carbs are known, just pure Quadrajet carbs, are known for very nice fuel metering efficiently. They are, unless you're Cliff Ruggles and you're watching this video, search up that name if you find the time. They are not the most performance-oriented carburetors, except for Cliff Ruggles and his Quadrajets, and a few other people, most likely. But keep in mind that they were designed for gas efficiency. it was a mileage carburetor in which the first 2 barrels of the 750 CFM carburetor were designed for, they were tiny, they were small, they were very efficient. So if you're getting on part throttle, it pulls air and fuel, less fuel compared to other carbs, through the front blades, the front bores rather, and burns the combustion out the exhaust, but more efficiently than most of the engines at the time. So great, that was a huge win. That the company could continue to produce V8s and have it be effective for their cars, while also using a carb that was more efficient than a Holly, for example. Except that then the 2 rear bores, the 4-barrel aspect of the carburetor, the back 2 barrels, were massive, and it's debated whether it's called the Quadrajet moan or the Quadrajet roar or the Quadrajet wah when the rear barrels open, front and rear barrels, but rear specifically, because they're controlled, the fuel metering is controlled via an air valve. So as air is rushing through the carburetor and the blades are open underneath it and the engine is pulling a vacuum through, the rushing air in the vacuum will start to tilt those blades open. And the sound coming by the blades is very distinct. You can certainly find Quadrajet roar, moan, pick your words, on YouTube. Those videos are everywhere, and understandably they're quite nice for people that are running them. I think there's actually one with like a Dodge Polara, a 440 Magnum motor in a Polara, that is that's one of my distinct Quadrajet memories. Like I watched that video and I was like, oh yeah, that's like my car. And that 76 Corvette didn't go so fast. Sounded pretty good though. So from here, I moved to a Buick Riviera, 1967. And that Corvette was a full street car. Never knew at the time what the drag strip was. It wasn't a thought in my mind. And I remember actually looking at camshafts and being like, why is there so much duration? What are all these numbers? Who would ever make a drag car? Here I am, guilty about 8 to 10 years later. Oops. But with the Buick, it was a street car first. It had a 7-800 Buick BOP Quadrajet. I believe they made the primaries and the secondaries. Primaries being the front 2 small barrels, the secondaries, the rear, being much larger. I believe they combined to 800 CFM. I don't remember exactly how they did it or why. But in short, that car did very well. It took the car back and forth across the streets. It went a 1469 in the quarter mile at like 93 mile an hour. Not too fast at all, but not too bad for 4,500 pounds. So I was hooked. And that car got taken off and then I put on a 850 CFM Cliff Ruggles modified Quadrajet. And I changed 4 other things at the same time on the car. So nothing, I can't really say that's what made the car go 13.8. I swapped camshafts, heads, a few other things as well, intake, and even headers. So, oh well, it was fun, and I did it no matter what. So, more experience with Quadrajets. Then, it all kind of got more interesting from a racing perspective when I bought the 65 Cutlass, and that had an 850 Quadrators, 850 Holly on it, and it was a 4150 style Holly, and it was reminiscent of those that are familiar with Barry Grant. It kind of looked like a Gold Claw carburetor. My friend Jake has had one of those, and well, it worked for a good time, but you know, Hollies are notoriously rich at part throttle. They just are, because there's fuel metering in those that are controlled by 4 jets, 2 front, 2 main, 2 rear, excuse me. The main jets they're all referred to as main jets. And unfortunately, there's a power valve, which is vacuum operated via, you know, engine sucking air through the metering blocks, pulling fuel through the venturi rather, try again, and that vacuum keeps that closed. But if there's an absence of vacuum, let's say 4 inches of vacuum, 4 inches of mercury is how they would measure it, they would say, okay, no vacuum, dump fuel. Engine is demanding fuel. So that's about how that would work. And they're good drag racing carbs. They just are. They're relatively simple. They're very customizable, and they're quick to change jets with compared to a quadrajet, in which the whole top of the carb has to come off, about 9-10 screws, and then keeping all the linkages just in place so you don't accidentally go out to the next pass at the track with no accelerator pump. Yeah, don't do that. And that works for a Holly too. You can do that with both carbs. You can forget that for both. Don't be fooled. So, especially double pumpers, front and rear, make sure you have both. Well, when you're R&Ring a Holly carb, a 4150 style, or a 4500 series Dominator, like is on the 65 now, you want to make sure those 2 arms are on the accelerator pumps when you are putting the carbs, fuel bowls, front and rear back on. Otherwise, you will end up with no pump shot in either the front or the rear bowl or the rear venturis. And then the car might hiccup off the line, it might do other nasty things. So, I kind of went over what I was going to say. 4150 series, generally you go from the really small like circle track ones. I think they get down to like 500 or 650, but they also have 2 barrels in which they're like factory spec racing. Not to quote the circle track guys, the roundy round guys, but if it's dirt or if it's asphalt, generally my knowledge says it's pretty similar. They have a spec carburetor they can use. Does it prevent them from making very good horsepower? No, they still do it. But just the 2 barrels down to like 500 or lower CFM. There's 390, I know of that. And then the smallest Dominator you can get is a 750. People have kind of debunked those as, wow, just avoid it. If you don't need that much, don't buy it. If you just don't need a Dominator until, super spitball 650 horse. And then you don't really need one on the street unless you want to burn gas like it's, unless you have infinite money and you don't care about washing your rings out. That's kind of a generalization. But you want to keep in mind speedability versus drag racing. A Dominator is a better drag racing carb than it is a street carb. A Quadrajet is a better street carb than it is a drag racing carb. Thermoquad and Quadrajet live in the same realm. They are better street carbs than drag carbs, and that's fine. No one designed it to do everything. They didn't want it to do everything. If they did, they'd have to make compromises elsewhere. So for the street, Quadrajet, Thermoquad, Edelbrock, fine. Edelbrock can stay on the street side. And then, street strip, consider a Holly, 4150 style. I drove the car, 65 Cutlass, to the track filled that at 8 gallons of fuel in the tank. That's the whole tank capacity. Drove it 75 miles to the track, and just about was on fumes when I pulled into the tech line just to get the car and myself into the track, into Lebanon Valley in New York. So that worked. It worked. It was a great, 3,500 RPM on the highway the whole way there. And on that particular day, the car cracked off, as I was learning it, a 13.6, 12.08, and then finally finished the day with an 11.72 before I think on that pass blew out the number 8 exhaust port gasket, and then drove it all the way home. All the way home. And maybe I have a few less brain cells as a result of that, but hey, that's okay. It was a lot of fun, and quickly realized after that, wow, this is not only as much fun as I was certain it was after racing the Riviera for probably 30 to 40 passes, but I'd never gone faster than 13.8. So to go from 13.6 or 13.8 really to 11.7 in a day, great. I'm not John Force, that's not my last name, but it was quite fun. So then Street Strip, Street Strip 4150 Holly. That's generally a great place to start. And then how you size that is entirely based on what your engine needs. Summit Racing has a nice calculator for street CFM, racing CFM, for displacement of your engine versus RPM it's going to see, because a 305 Chevy, this spins 4,500 RPM, is going to have significantly different airflow characteristics and demands than a 496 spinning to 7,500. It's just, and that's not even a big block. It's just going to be a different ball game, maybe even a different sport. So that's the thing. You got to consider all of these things when picking the carb for the application. You can generally skew the street carburetor smaller because you don't maybe not need all of that high RPM power. You want the efficiency, and you don't also need to go, 100 and something plus in the quarter mile. It's just not a need for you at that point. Then for strip only, and your engine can demand enough horsepower and airflow to run a Dominator, most people do. There's big small blocks with Dominators. There's small big blocks with Dominators. There's big block everything. Fords, Chevys, big block Buicks. There's a few families out in New York especially that I think very highly of that race. Well, one of them races a Pro Charge. CSU, I believe, blow-through carb. We'll talk about blow-through carbs in a moment. But depending on the application, generally a Dominator is a strip-only carb. Yes, you get the 2-circuit Dominator, which is more desirable for some, than the 3-circuit, which is apparently slightly harder to tune. And if you do have that issue, they say, oh, there's like this intermittent transition period. I'd say maybe there's some truth to that. This carb works really well. Maybe if I put on a Stinnett carb tomorrow, the car would do a little differently. Or pick your favorite name brand carburetor builder and throw it up against my car. They're probably going to do better. However, to get your car in the ballpark, and then when this thing goes 991, 992, 994, 996, 994, 995 during the same day, you're pretty close to where you want to be. The only thing this guy needs to do is react properly to the tree. Guilty. Doesn't always happen. And then so I briefly touched on, now changing topics to blow-through carburetors, whether it be turbo, ProCharger, and then draw-through carburetors like Roots blown carburetors. Generally, this is weird. You might like this because if it's a Roots carburetor and it sits on top of a 671 or sits on top of an 871, and there's two of them, or there's a single one, Generally, you want a bigger carburetor because it's pulling through not only the open air, but it's pulling through the carburetor. So the bigger a hole you have to pull air through, the less restriction the blower is seeing. And that's how sometimes you can get away with much more carburetor than you may otherwise need. Being what you would compare the street to the strip. You could get away with probably two 650 Hollies on a 671 blown 383 Chevy. Very generalizing here. The advice is general, but this description is accurate. So very general, hey, 383, 671, two 650 Hollies. Well, that same engine, if you turned it all the way up and you really wanted to run high boost, well, you might be able to take those same carburetors and chuck them. Say, actually, I'd really like to run same engine, 671, 383, two 950s. If the engine demands the airflow with the pulley change, that might be something that you have to consider. If there's a blow-through situation, which doesn't require upsizing, generally if it's a ProCharger or a turbo, you can downsize to something a little bit lower. CSU's most popular, from my understanding, combination that people come in and ask for is a F1A94, F1R, F1A, F1C, a D1, whatever. It's a type of ProCharger that they then put a 750 Holly on that's modified to their standards. Great, excellent. That seems to work very well. You don't need to put a Dominator on anything making 800 horsepower at the supercharged level, so they say, if it's blow through. This is just a generalization, but that's what they recommend. They say you do not need a blow through Dominator or a blow through even an 850 carburetor, 4150 style Holly for all of these examples, if it's going to make less than 1,000 horsepower or less than 1,200 horsepower. So does it apply directly to you? No, maybe not. But if you're thinking about it and what people say, you say, I hadn't considered that. Maybe that's the answer. So, and then kind of what's next for carburation? A lot of people would say fuel injection. Fuel injection is the answer. There's this technological age that we're in right now. The muscle cars are only getting faster. People, I think it was World of Pro Mod or something in Bradenton, Florida, like the cars. Oh, well, there's two examples. First, Bradenton, I think it was like World Series of Pro Mod. They were making passes to be competitive. You had to be in the 370s. That was unheard of several years ago. You had a car that was in the threes, you probably would show up and win. Texas 2K, this is now 2 weeks ago or less. They had 18, I believe, cars over 200 miles an hour in the roll racing event. And I think 1320, I can't remember the gentleman's name right now, but Kyle, I think it might have been Kyle, was saying that at a minimum, they'd seen like 3 to 4 cars in the past few years. Those would be the ones over 200 miles an hour. And that is just incredible. And whether it be fuel injection, which most of those cars are, carburation, which not many of the Texas 2K cars are, but fuel injection is the future. But there's something so simplistic about a carburetor that is desirable for many people. If you're a bracket racer and you know what your car does almost every single pass and you don't want it to change, well, the weather may change and you may change your dial slightly. It's a 1050 right now. Well, the weather's gotten a little worse. I think the car's going to slow down 200ths. Okay, great. 1052. You can control that. And you did that without adjusting the carburetor. And if you do adjust the carburetor, maybe you've screwed yourself. Some of the best racers I know say don't change anything going into elimination rounds unless the car didn't run right. If it ran awful or ran way off its beat where it normally does, you have a problem. But to change anything on the carburetor when it's been doing fine is a rookie mistake that I've made. Everyone makes. You try to be a hero. You try to fix things that aren't the problem. And maybe the carburetor was wrong all along. But if you fix it by changing something, well, you'll never really know. And I say you'll never really know because maybe you lost for another reason. Maybe you were slow on the tree. Maybe you were too fast on the tree. But the simplicity of carburetors as a whole is, I won't call it to be studied because we've been studying it for many years. Edelbrock recently put out a new 650 and a 850 4150 style carburetor. It has some fancy name, and not Engine Masters, but I think Power Masters, that stuck in my head. It's not that, but it's the show where there's Pat Topolinski and I think Frankie Foreman, and Power Nation, and they are running a series of tests, recently, that they take this new, I think maybe VRS carb, Edelbrock something, and it goes on multiple engines at once, and it's a new design on the old take of a Holley. There's also Quick Fuel, there's Proform, which was on the 65, and then is also on my buddy's car. So the designs are endless. The carburetors, I don't think, it has never been as strong in terms of research and development. Every year that passes, it gets better in some way, as you would hope. But I guess to wrap up carburation, if your engine has a carburetor, it's pretty tunable. Is it EFI? No. Was it ever pretending to be EFI? No.